The blood on the horizon painted Arizona's sky crimson as Abigail Reed stared at the telegram that had destroyed her world for the second time. 3 years a widow, and now the bank was coming for her ranch. Her trembling hands crumpled the paper as she sank to her knees on the weathered porch, the year 1878 proving as merciless as the desert itself. "Madam, you all right there?" The deep voice startled her from her grief. Abigail looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. A stranger on horseback, dust covered from the trail, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She quickly wiped her tears, straightening her faded blue dress as she rose. "I'm fine," she lied, tucking the telegram into her pocket. "Just a bit of bad news." The rider dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. As he approached, she noticed his eyes first clear blue against sun-bronzed skin. His clothes were trail-worn but neat, a gun holstered at his hip with the casual comfort of a man who knew how to use it but preferred not to. "Name's Jack Harmon," he said, removing his hat. "Looking for work, if you've got any. Been riding north from Tuxen and saw your place." Abigail almost laughed at the cruel timing. "I'm afraid I'll be looking for work myself soon enough, Mr. Harmon. The bank's foreclosing in 30 days. His eyes assessed the modest ranch, the small house, the barn that needed repair, the meager herd of cattle visible in the distance before returning to her face. "Shame," he said simply. "Good land here." "It was my husband's dream," she replied, her voice catching. "Thomas died 3 years ago. Cattle fever, I've been trying to keep it going, but—" She gestured helplessly at the telegram in her pocket. Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sometimes a pair of hands can make a difference. I've worked cattle all my life. Could help you get things in order, maybe find a way to save this place." "Why would you do that?" Abigail asked, suspicion edging her voice. Men didn't offer help without wanting something in return. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. "Been drifting too long," he answered, looking toward the distant mountains. "Sometimes a man needs to put down stakes, even for a little while." He turned back to her, his gaze direct. "I'm not asking for wages, just meals and a place in your barn. If we save the ranch, maybe we can discuss regular work then." Abigail studied him carefully. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps mid-30s, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of hard years. But there was something steady about him, something she hadn't seen in a man since Thomas. "I can't pay you," she said finally, "and I can't promise we'll save it." "Fair enough," Jack replied, offering his hand. "Shall we shake on it?" His hand was calloused against hers, warm and strong. For the first time in months, Abigail felt a flicker of hope. "There's stew for supper," she said, turning toward the house. "And the barn's got a decent loft for sleeping." Jack's smile was brief but genuine. "Best offer I've had in weeks." That night, after showing Jack to the barn, Abigail sat alone at her kitchen table, studying the ledgers that had become her nightly torment. The numbers never changed, never improved. Thomas had taken loans to expand the herd, betting on a future that disappeared with his last breath. Each month since, she'd fallen further behind. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Jack stood there, hat in hand. "Pardon the intrusion, Mrs. Reed, but I noticed your windmill's not drawing water properly. Thought I might take a look at it tomorrow." "Abigail," she corrected him. "Just Abigail is fine, and yes, it's been struggling since spring." He nodded, eyes falling to the open ledgers. "Those telling a sad story," she sighed, gesturing for him to sit. "The bank wants $300 by month's end. I've got maybe 50. Jack settled into a chair, placing his hat on the table. "How many head of cattle do you have?" 43. "Not enough to make a real profit, but too many for me to manage alone." She passed him the ledger. "I've been selling 1 or 2 each month just to buy supplies." He studied the figures, his brow furrowed. "You're getting swindled on prices," he said finally. "Cattle are worth more than this, especially good stock. The only buyer who comes this far out is Willis Morgan. He knows I can't drive them to market myself." Jack's jaw tightened. "Morgan. I've heard of him, has a reputation for squeezing desperate ranchers." "That would be me," Abigail said with a bitter smile. "Desperate? Not anymore," Jack replied, closing the ledger with decision. I think I might have a plan. It won't be easy, but it could work." For the first time, Abigail truly looked at him not as a drifter offering help, but as a man with purpose. Something in his steady gaze made her believe him, despite everything life had taught her about false hopes. "I've lost everything once before," she said quietly, "when Thomas died. I'm not sure I can survive losing it all again." Jack's eyes held hers for a long moment before he spoke. "Then we'll make sure you don't have to." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Abigail woke to the unfamiliar sound of hammering. From her window, she saw Jack already at work, repairing the sagging corral fence. She dressed quickly and made a large breakfast, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd cooked for anyone but herself. When she called him in, he washed up at the pump, rolling down his shirt sleeves before entering the house. The simple courtesy reminded her of Thomas, bringing an unexpected ache to her chest. "Hope you're hungry," she said, setting plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits on the table. "Always am," he replied with a smile that softened his weathered features. As they ate, Jack outlined his plan. "There's a cattle buyer from Kansas City due in Tuxen next week. If we can get your herd there, we'd fetch twice what Morgan's paying, maybe more." Tuxen. "That's nearly 100 miles. 5 days' drive if we're lucky with weather," he acknowledged, "but worth it for the difference in price." Abigail shook her head. "I can't leave the ranch for that long." "Your neighbor to the east, elderly couple, Henderson, I think the name, as they mentioned they'd be happy to keep an eye on your place when I passed by yesterday." "You've been busy," she observed, surprised. "Don't believe in wasting time," he replied. "If we leave tomorrow, we can make it to Tuxen with a day to spare before the buyer moves on." Abigail stared into her coffee, mind racing. It was a desperate plan, but what choice did she have? "I haven't driven cattle since Thomas got sick," she admitted, "and never more than a few miles." Jack's expression remained confident. "You'll remember quick enough. Cattle haven't changed much in 3 years," she laughed despite herself. "No, I suppose they haven't." She took a deep breath, decision made. "All right, Mr. Harmon, let's drive some cattle." They spent the day preparing mending tack, gathering supplies, planning the route. Jack rode out to check the herd, returning with approval of their condition. "Good stock," he said. "Your husband knew his cattle." "It was all he ever wanted," Abigail replied, sadness coloring her voice. "His own land, his own herd. We came out from Missouri right after we married, built everything ourselves." "Hard to lose something you've put so much into," Jack observed quietly. Abigail looked at him sharply. "Sounds like you speak from experience." He nodded, his gaze distant. "Had a small spread in Colorado once. Lost it in '73 when the markets crashed." He didn't elaborate, and Abigail didn't press. Some stories were too painful to share with near strangers. That evening, as Abigail packed provisions, she found herself watching Jack through the window as he worked with the horses. There was an easy competence to him that she'd always admired in capable men. For the first time in years, she felt the burden of the ranch lighten slightly, shared with someone else, if only temporarily. They set out at dawn the next day, the cattle moving reluctantly at first, then finding their rhythm. Abigail rode her mare, Isabella, while Jack mounted his sturdy bay gelding. The familiar motion of horseback brought back memories of happier times when she and Thomas had worked the land together, full of dreams for the future. "You ride well," Jack commented as they pushed the herd south. "Grew up on a farm in Missouri," she replied. "Been riding since before I could walk, according to my father." The first day passed without incident, the cattle moving steadily across the arid landscape. As evening approached, they made camp near a small creek, the herd settling down to graze and rest. Jack built a fire while Abigail prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork. The familiar routine of trail cooking came back to her easily, bringing with it a strange contentment she hadn't expected. "Tell me about your husband," Jack said as they sat by the fire, the desert night growing cool around them. Abigail poked at the embers with a stick, surprised by the request. "Few people asked about Thomas anymore. He was a dreamer," she said finally. "Always saw possibilities where others saw nothing. When we first came to this land, it was just empty desert to most folks, but Thomas saw a ranch, a home. She smiled at the memory. He worked from sunrise to sunset every day, building, planning. Even when he got sick, he kept going as long as he could. Sounds like a good man. He was, she agreed, but dreams don't always pay the bills. When he died, I found out just how much debt he'd taken on. Jack nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes the hardest part of loving someone is carrying on with their dreams after they're gone. The simple truth of his words caught her off guard. Yes, she whispered, that's exactly it. They fell silent, the crackling fire and distant lowing of cattle the only sounds in the vast darkness. For the first time in 3 years, Abigail felt the iron band of grief around her heart loosen just slightly. The second day brought challenges. A rattlesnake spooked the lead steer, nearly causing a stampede that took both of them an hour to settle. By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly, slowing their progress as the cattle sought what little shade they could find. We need to push them a bit harder, Jack said, wiping sweat from his brow. There's a water hole about 5 miles ahead. We can rest them properly there. Abigail nodded, too tired for conversation. Her muscles ached from the unaccustomed work, but she refused to complain. Every mile brought them closer to saving her ranch. The water hole, when they reached it, was a small oasis of cottonwoods and clear water. The cattle moved eagerly to drink, while Abigail dismounted with a barely suppressed groan. You're doing well, Jack said, handing her a canteen. Most city folks would have quit by now. She drank deeply before responding. I'm not most folks, and I haven't been a city girl for a long time. His smile was warm with approval. No, you certainly haven't. That evening, as they made camp, clouds gathered on the horizon. Jack watched them with concern. Might get some weather tomorrow, he observed. Desert storms can be unpredictable. Abigail followed his gaze to the distant lightning. Will it slow us down? Depends on how bad it gets. Cattle don't mind a little rain, but thunder makes them skittish. They ate quickly, setting up a watch rotation for the night. Abigail took first shift, sitting wrapped in her blanket as the others slept. The vast starlit sky above her stirred memories of nights spent with Thomas, planning their future beneath the same stars. How quickly those dreams had shattered. When Jack relieved her at midnight, he brought her a cup of coffee. Get some rest, he said gently. Tomorrow might be challenging. His prediction proved accurate. They woke to distant thunder and dark skies. The cattle were restless, sensing the approaching storm. They managed only a few miles before the rain began, a sudden, violent downpour that turned the desert floor to mud within minutes. We need to find shelter, Jack shouted over the deluge, pointing to a rocky outcropping ahead. Try to keep them together. For 2 hours they fought to hold the herd, rain pouring down in sheets that made it nearly impossible to see. Abigail's clothes were soaked through, her hands numb on the reins as Isabella struggled through the mud. When lightning struck a nearby mesquite, sending several cattle into a panic, she reacted instinctively, cutting off their escape route despite the danger. Well done, Jack called, driving the scattered animals back toward the main herd. By late afternoon, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape of temporary streams and pools. They'd lost valuable time, but miraculously, no cattle. They made camp early, both too exhausted to continue. Jack built a larger fire than usual, and they spread their sodden belongings nearby to dry. You handled yourself well today, he said as they huddled near the flames. Not many would have kept their head in those conditions. Abigail wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders, still shivering despite the fire's warmth. When you're fighting for everything you have left, you find strength you didn't know was there. Jack studied her for a long moment. Is that what you're doing, fighting for what's left? The question pierced deeper than she expected. What else would I be doing? Living, he suggested quietly, not just surviving. Abigail looked away, uncomfortable with his perception. Hard to live when you're constantly afraid of losing the roof over your head. True enough, he acknowledged, but fear's a poor companion for the long trail. She wanted to be angry at his presumption, but the gentle understanding in his voice diffused her defensiveness. It's been a long time since I thought beyond the next month, the next bill, she admitted. Sometimes I forget there might be more to life than just keeping Thomas's dream alive. And what about Abigail's dreams? He asked. The question caught her off guard. What were her dreams now? She'd subsumed herself so completely in Thomas's vision, then in the desperate struggle to preserve it, that she'd lost sight of her own desires. I don't know anymore, she said honestly. Maybe that's something I need to figure out. Jack nodded, adding another log to the fire. Plenty of time to think on a cattle drive, he said with a slight smile. Now get some sleep. You'll feel better when your clothes aren't soaked through. The next morning dawned clear and warm, the desert already beginning to dry under the relentless sun. They made good progress, the cattle seemingly eager to move after the forced delay. By midday, they'd crossed into a valley of surprising beauty, wildflowers carpeting the ground in patches of yellow and purple. I never knew this was here, Abigail said, marveling at the unexpected color. All these years, just a day's ride from my home. Desert's full of surprises, Jack replied. Most people just see the harshness, miss the beauty underneath. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of the drive now familiar. Abigail found herself studying Jack when he wasn't looking the way he sat his horse with easy confidence, how his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, missing nothing. How long have you been drifting? She asked finally. He considered the question. About 5 years now. After I lost my ranch, I tried settling in a few places, but nothing stuck. Don't you get lonely? His smile held a touch of sadness. Sometimes, but there's a freedom in it too. No roots means nothing to lose. Also nothing to gain, she pointed out. Jack nodded, conceding the point. Maybe that's why I stopped at your place. Time to start gaining again. The simple honesty of his answer touched her. Before she could respond, a shout from ahead drew their attention. 3 riders approached from the south, moving fast. Jack's hand moved casually to his gun. Keep driving, he told her quietly. Let me handle this. The riders reined in about 20 yards away. Even at a distance, Abigail recognized the center figure Willis Morgan, the cattle buyer who'd been underpaying her for years. Her stomach tightened with dread. Well, well, Morgan called, his voice carrying across the space between them. Mrs. Reed, quite a ways from home, aren't you? Jack moved his horse forward, positioning himself between Abigail and the newcomers. Just driving cattle to market, he said, his tone neutral but watchful. No law against that, Morgan's gaze shifted to Jack, assessing. Don't believe we've met. You working for the widow now, name's Jack Harmon, and yes, I'm helping Mrs. Reed get fair prices for her stock. Morgan's laugh held no humor. Is that so? And I suppose you think those fair prices aren't available locally? We know they aren't, Abigail said, moving up beside Jack despite his warning glance. Not from you anyway, Morgan's face darkened. Now that's unkind, Mrs. Reed. I've always paid market value for your cattle. Half market value, Jack corrected him, and I suspect you've been doing the same to other struggling ranchers in the area. The 2 men flanking Morgan shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward their weapons. Jack remained outwardly relaxed, but Abigail could sense his heightened alertness. These cattle are spoken for, Morgan said, dropping any pretense of friendliness. I've got an arrangement with Mrs. Reed. No arrangement, Abigail countered. You've been taking advantage of my situation, and it stops now. Morgan's eyes narrowed. You might want to reconsider, madam. Roads to Tuxen can be dangerous. Accidents happen. The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. Jack's voice, when he spoke, was deadly quiet. That sounded an awful lot like a threat, Morgan. Not wise, especially when outnumbered. Morgan glanced around, confusion crossing his face. Outnumbered. I count 2 of you and 3 of us, unless you're including the cows. Jack smiled slightly. Look to your left, about 200 yards. All eyes turned to see a group of riders emerging from a stand of mesquite, at least 6 men moving with purpose toward them. Apache friends of mine, Jack explained calmly. Been traveling parallel to us since yesterday. They don't take kindly to threats against women or cattle thieves. Morgan's face paled. He clearly hadn't expected complications. This isn't over, he muttered, wheeling his horse around. His companions followed quickly, dust rising behind them as they rode south. Only when they were well out of sight did Abigail release the breath she'd been holding. Apache friends, Jack's grin was boyish suddenly. Cattle drovers from the Circle B ranch. I spotted them earlier and figured they might come in handy. They're heading to Tuxen too. As if on cue, the approaching riders reached them, their leader a weathered man in his 50s extending his hand to Jack. Thought that was you, Harmon, been a while. Too long, Ben, Jack agreed, shaking his hand. Appreciate the timing, the older man nodded toward Abigail. Madam, that Morgan's bad business, been squeezing small ranchers all over the territory. So I'm learning, she replied. Thank you for your help. Safety in numbers, Ben said pragmatically. You're welcome to drive with us to Tuxen if you'd like. Jack looked to Abigail, letting her decide. She nodded gratefully. We'd appreciate that. That evening, their small camp expanded to include Ben's outfit, 7 men total, with over 100 head of cattle. The additional hands meant easier watches and greater security. Around the campfire, the mood was relaxed as the men shared stories and passed a bottle of whiskey. Abigail, the only woman present, found herself treated with unfailing courtesy. She listened to tales of cattle drives and range wars, glimpsing a world she'd only peripherally been part of despite her years on the ranch. Jack sat beside her, occasionally adding to a story or correcting an exaggeration. His shoulder brushed hers when he reached for the coffee pot, a brief contact that she found oddly comforting. Morgan won't give up easily, Ben warned as the conversation turned serious. He's got too much invested in controlling the local market. We'll be in Tuxen tomorrow, Jack replied. Not much he can do once we're there. Just watch your back on the return journey, the older man advised. And yours too, madam, Abigail nodded, the reminder of the threat sobering. Will it ever be worth it? She asked quietly. Saving the ranch only to live under Morgan's shadow, Jack's expression was thoughtful. Men like Morgan only have power when people are isolated, afraid. Break that and they're just bullies with no one to push around. Harmon's right, Ben agreed. What you're doing, standing up to him, others will follow. That's what men like Morgan fear most. Later, as the fire burned low and most of the men bedded down, Abigail found herself unable to sleep. The events of the day, Morgan's threats, and the unexpected alliance with Ben's outfit left her mind racing. She walked a short distance from camp, finding a flat rock to sit on beneath the star-filled sky. The desert night was peaceful, the distant lowing of cattle a reassuring soundtrack. Footsteps crunched softly behind her. Mind some company? Jack asked. She shook her head, making room on the rock. Just needed some quiet to think. He settled beside her, respecting her contemplative mood with silence. After a while, she spoke. I've been thinking about what you asked about my dreams, not just Thomas's. Jack waited, giving her space to continue. When we first came west, I had my own vision for our life. A home filled with children, a garden that would be the envy of the territory, maybe even a small school nearby that I could teach at. She sighed. But we were so focused on building the ranch that we put off having children. Then Thomas got sick and everything became about survival. It's not too late, Jack said gently. For some of those dreams, at least. Abigail looked at him, really looked, seeing the kindness in his eyes, the quiet strength that had drawn her to him from the beginning. Sometimes I think it is, she admitted. I'm 31, Jack. Most women my age have half-grown children already. And who would want to take on a widow with a struggling ranch and too many memories? The question hung between them, unintentionally revealing more than she'd meant to. Jack's gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them. A man who sees your worth, he said finally, his voice low. Who understands that memories are part of who you are, not obstacles to overcome. Her heart quickened at his words, at the intensity in his eyes. For a moment she thought he might reach for her hand, but he stood instead, offering a steadying presence without pressure. We should get some rest, he said. Tomorrow's an important day. Abigail nodded, suddenly grateful for his restraint. Whatever was growing between them needed time, space to develop naturally. As they walked back to camp, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the tentative stirring of hope, not just for her ranch, but for herself. They reached Tuxen by midday, driving the cattle into the holding pens near the rail yard. The town bustled with activity, the cattle buyer from Kansas City already conducting business with several other ranchers. Jack handled the negotiations with a skill that impressed Abigail. By late afternoon, they'd secured a price nearly triple what Morgan had been paying. When the buyer counted out the money, more cash than Abigail had seen in years, she could hardly believe their success. $360, she said, still staring at the money as they sat in a small cafe afterward. More than enough to pay the bank and have some left over. Jack smiled at her wonder. Told you your cattle were worth more. Good breeding shows. She carefully tucked the money into an inner pocket of her jacket. We should start back tomorrow. I want to get this to the bank as soon as possible. Jack nodded, though a shadow crossed his face. Ben's outfit is staying in town a few days. We'll be on our own for the return journey. You're worried about Morgan. He's not a man who likes losing, Jack acknowledged, but we'll be careful. They spent the night at a modest hotel, taking separate rooms. Abigail reveled in the luxury of a real bath and clean sheets after days on the trail. Yet as she lay in bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of town life, she found herself missing the open sky and Jack's reassuring presence nearby. The journey home began peacefully enough. Without cattle to drive, they made good time, covering nearly twice the distance each day. Jack remained vigilant, however, frequently checking their back trail and choosing campsites with defensive positions. On the third day, as they passed through a narrow canyon, Jack suddenly reined in, signaling for silence. Abigail froze, scanning the rocky slopes above them. What is it? She whispered. Not sure, he replied. Something doesn't feel right. The birds stopped singing. Before she could respond, a shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dust at Isabella's feet. The mare reared in panic as more shots followed, echoing off the canyon walls. Ride. Jack shouted, drawing his gun and returning fire toward a cluster of boulders above them. Get to those trees. Abigail spurred Isabella forward, ducking low over the horse's neck as bullets whined past. She reached the relative safety of a stand of juniper trees, Jack close behind her. They dismounted quickly, using the horses as partial cover while assessing the situation. Morgan, she asked, heart pounding. Jack nodded grimly. Him or his men, I count 3 shooters, maybe 4. What do we do? Wait them out, he said, checking his ammunition. They'll have to come down eventually if they want the money. They'll kill us first, Abigail said, the reality of their situation sinking in. Jack's expression was determined. Not if I can help it. He glanced at her, concern evident. You know how to use a gun. Thomas taught me, she confirmed, accepting the small revolver he offered. For nearly an hour they remained pinned down, occasional shots keeping them from making a break for open ground. The sun began to sink toward the horizon, shadows lengthening across the canyon floor. They're trying to wait for darkness, Jack observed. We need to move before then. As if hearing his words, the gunfire suddenly increased, bullets thudding into the trees around them. Jack returned fire carefully, conserving ammunition. I think I hit one, he said after a particularly intense exchange. They're down to 2 or 3 now. A voice called out from the rocks above. Just leave the money, Harmon, the woman too. You can ride out alive. That's Morgan, Abigail whispered, recognizing the voice. Jack's jaw tightened. Not happening, he shouted back. You want the money, come and take it. More shots answered him, one grazing his arm and drawing blood. Abigail gasped, moving to examine the wound despite the danger. It's nothing, he insisted, though his face had paled slightly. Just a scratch. We can't stay here, she said, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind his arm. They'll wear us down eventually. Jack nodded, thinking rapidly. There's a wash about 50 yards east. If we can reach it, we might be able to circle behind them. They'll see us the moment we leave cover. Not if they're distracted. Jack removed his hat, placing it on a low branch where it would be visible from above. When I fire at them, you run for the wash. Don't stop, don't look back. I'll be right behind you. Abigail shook her head. I'm not leaving you, you're not, he assured her. Just giving us a fighting chance. His hand briefly covered hers. Trust me, Before she could protest further, he moved to the edge of their cover and fired rapidly toward the ambushers, forcing them to duck. "Now," he shouted. Abigail ran, heart hammering as she expected bullets to find her at any moment. She reached the dry stream bed and tumbled down its bank, scratching her hands and face on the rocky soil. Seconds later, Jack slid down beside her, breathing hard. "You all right?" he asked, checking her for injuries. She nodded, too breathless to speak. They crouched in the wash, its depth providing good cover as they moved eastward, away from the ambush site. "What's the plan?" she finally managed to ask. "Circle around, get to higher ground," Jack explained. "Turn their advantage against them." The wash eventually opened onto a steep slope covered with loose shale and scattered vegetation. They climbed cautiously, using every bit of cover available. By the time they reached a position overlooking the canyon, the sun was touching the western horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. From their vantage point, they could see their horses still ground tied in the junipers, and beyond them, the shapes of men moving among the boulders on the opposite slope. 3 of them, Jack confirmed, Morgan and 2 others. "They don't know we flanked them," Abigail observed. Jack nodded, a grim smile forming. "Which gives us the advantage now," he raised his voice suddenly. "Morgan might want to rethink your position." The men below froze, then scattered for cover as they realized their quarry was now above them. Jack fired once, deliberately wide, causing further confusion. "You're outnumbered and outflanked," he called. "Throw down your weapons and ride out. This doesn't have to end badly." There was a long pause before Morgan's voice echoed back. "This is between us, Harmon." "The woman's got nothing to do with it." "She's got everything to do with it," Jack replied. "It's her cattle, her money, her life you're threatening, and I take that personally." Another shot rang out, this one closer to their position. Jack pushed Abigail lower, shielding her with his body. "We can't stay here," she whispered. "It'll be dark soon, and they know roughly where we are." Jack nodded, his expression troubled. "I don't want to kill them if I can avoid it." "They don't seem to share your reluctance," Abigail pointed out. Before Jack could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Riders were approaching from the east, at least a dozen, moving fast. "Who the hell is that?" Jack muttered, straining to see in the fading light. The newcomers came into view, and Abigail's heart leapt with recognition. "It's Ben and his men, indeed." The cattle drovers from the Circle B had arrived, spreading out to surround the canyon. One of Morgan's men panicked, making a break for their horses. A warning shot from Ben's rifle stopped him in his tracks. "Morgan," Ben's voice boomed across the canyon, "you're surrounded. Drop your weapons or we start shooting for real." The fight went out of the ambushers quickly after that. With no chance of escape and overwhelming odds against them, they surrendered, throwing down their guns as Ben's men closed in. Jack and Abigail made their way carefully down the slope to where Morgan and his companions were being disarmed and bound. "Perfect timing," Jack said, clasping Ben's hand gratefully. "How did you know?" The older man grinned. "Didn't. We finished our business early and figured we'd catch up to you, make sure you got home safe. Heard the shooting from a mile away." Morgan glared at them, defeat and hatred mingling in his expression. "This isn't over," he growled. "Actually, it is," Ben replied. "Sheriff in Tuxen was mighty interested in your business practices. Seems you've been threatening ranchers all over the territory. He's expecting you back for a conversation." He nodded to his men. "Take them to town, we'll catch up." As Morgan and his men were led away, Abigail felt a wave of relief so profound her knees nearly buckled. Jack steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "You're safe now," he said softly. "It's over." The full impact of what they'd survived hit her suddenly, and she turned into his embrace without thinking, burying her face against his chest. His arms encircled her, strong and reassuring. "I thought we were going to die," she whispered. His hand stroked her hair gently. "I wouldn't have let that happen." When she finally pulled back, she was acutely aware of Ben and his remaining men watching them with poorly concealed interest. Jack seemed to notice too, clearing his throat awkwardly. "We should get moving," he said. "Still a couple hours of daylight left." They retrieved their horses and continued homeward, Ben and 3 of his men accompanying them as additional protection. The conversation around the campfire that night was animated, the drovers recounting their version of events with increasing embellishment. Abigail sat quietly, watching Jack interact with the others. The easy camaraderie, the respect they showed him, it spoke of a man with a past fuller than he'd revealed to her. She wondered what else she didn't know about Jack Harmon and whether she'd have the chance to find out. As if sensing her thoughts, he glanced her way, a small smile lifting the corner of his mouth. Something passed between them, unspoken but real, an acknowledgement of what had begun to grow during their journey. The next afternoon, they reached Abigail's ranch. The sight of the modest house, the weathered barn, the familiar landscape filled her with unexpected emotion. Just days ago, she'd been prepared to lose it all. Now, with the money safely delivered to the bank that morning, the ranch was secure for a while at least. Ben and his men continued on after brief farewells, leaving Abigail and Jack standing in the yard, suddenly alone after days of constant companionship. "I should check on the remaining cattle," Jack said, breaking the awkward silence. "Make sure everything's all right here." Abigail nodded, watching him walk toward the corral. Something had shifted between them since the ambush, a new awareness that neither seemed ready to address. She busied herself reopening the house, airing out rooms and preparing a proper meal. By the time Jack returned, she had stew simmering and fresh bread cooling on the table. "Everything looks good," he reported, washing up at the pump outside. "Old man Henderson kept a good eye on things." They ate dinner with the ease of people accustomed to each other's company, discussing plans for improving the ranch now that immediate financial pressure was relieved. "Morgan won't be a problem anymore," Jack said confidently. "And with fair prices for your cattle, you should be able to build the herd back up." Abigail nodded, though his words triggered a realization she'd been avoiding. With the crisis resolved, Jack would likely move on. The thought left a hollow feeling in her chest. "What will you do now?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. Jack set down his fork, his expression thoughtful. "Haven't decided yet, might head north for a while." The answer, though expected, still hurt. Abigail busied herself clearing the dishes, keeping her back to him to hide her disappointment. "Of course," she said. "You've been a tremendous help, Jack. I can't thank you enough." "Abigail," his voice was gentle. When she didn't turn, he rose and moved to stand behind her. "Look at me, please." She turned slowly, composing her features into what she hoped was a polite smile. "You don't owe me any explanations. You're a drifter. I understood that from the beginning." Jack shook his head. "Is that what you think, that I'm just passing through? Isn't that what you said, that you might head north?" "I said I hadn't decided yet," he corrected her. "Because the decision isn't just mine to make." Confusion clouded her features. "I don't understand." Jack took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "I came here looking for work, a temporary place to stay. I found something I wasn't expecting." His eyes held hers, earnest and vulnerable. "I found you." Abigail's heart quickened. "Jack, let me finish," he said softly. "I've been drifting for 5 years because I had nothing to stay for, but these past days with you facing danger together, working side by side, they've shown me what I've been missing, what I want." "And what's that?" she whispered, afraid to hope. "A home," he answered simply. "A purpose, someone to build a future with." He took her hand gently. "I'm not Thomas, I can't replace him or what you had together, but if you'll let me, I'd like to stay, help you with the ranch. See if what's growing between us might flourish with time." Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, emotions too complex to name washing through her. Fear, hope, longing, all tangled together. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Open myself up again. The last time I loved someone, I lost everything. I can't go through that again." Jack's expression softened with understanding, his hand lifted to gently brush a tear from her cheek. "Then let's go through it together," he whispered. "The risk, the fear, all of it. Because the alternative, never loving again, never taking that chance, seems far worse to me." The simple truth of his words resonated deep within her. Abigail looked into his eyes and saw not just the cowboy who'd helped save her ranch, but a man offering his heart, asking for nothing but the chance to prove himself worthy of hers. Slowly, she nodded, a tentative smile breaking through her tears. Together, she agreed, the word both a promise and a beginning. Jack's answering smile was radiant as he drew her gently into his arms. His lips met hers in a kiss that held all the tenderness of new love and the promise of a shared future, one they would build together, day by day. The years that followed brought challenges, as all years do. The ranch prospered under their joint care, the herd growing to twice its original size. They added onto the house, creating a home that welcomed neighbors and travelers alike. 2 children eventually came, a boy with Jack's blue eyes and a girl who inherited Abigail's determination. The garden Abigail had once dreamed of flourished, becoming known throughout the territory for its beauty and bounty. And when Morgan was finally released from prison 3 years later, he found the territory changed. Small ranchers had formed a cooperative, ensuring fair prices and mutual protection. He left Arizona soon after, his power permanently broken. On quiet evenings, Abigail and Jack would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in hues of gold and crimson. Sometimes she would think of Thomas, grateful for the life they'd shared and the foundation he'd built. But her heart belonged fully to the present now, to the family she and Jack had created together. "Any regrets?" Jack asked one such evening, their hands intertwined as they watched their children playing in the yard. Abigail considered the question, remembering the frightened widow she'd been, the woman who'd almost let fear close her heart forever. "Not one," she answered truthfully. "Everything we went through led us here. I wouldn't change a single step of the journey." Jack's smile held all the warmth of the setting sun as he leaned over to kiss her, the gesture as familiar and essential as breathing. Together, they had transformed a struggling ranch into a thriving home, but more importantly, they had proven that second chances at love were not just possible but worth every risk along the way. In the fading light, with the desert stretching endlessly before them, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that some journeys were meant to be shared, some burdens carried by 2 hearts instead of one. And in that sharing, they had found not just survival, but a life rich beyond measure.